All right. Oh, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the next edition of the CEPR International Lending and Sovereign Debt webinar. It's a great pleasure to welcome today Pablo Ottonello, who is one of the leading people in the field. He has been pushing the agenda on sovereign risk, international finance in general. He's one of the young rising stars, if you want. I met him first at the NYU when he was a PhD student, and since then he's done a stellar career. What I really like about Pablo's work is that he's a theorist pushing the frontier there, but he also takes data very seriously and actually does really deep data work and actually pushes the frontier there as well. And that's quite a rare combination. So therefore, it's wonderful to have you today. The rules of the webinar, just to reiterate, Pablo will have 40 to 45 minutes to give his talk, and then we will open it up and have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A. And you can actually jump in, ask questions, and talk straight, with Pablo and with us by raising your hand. But I'll announce that once we are there. Well, with no further ado, I would hand over to Pablo. Welcome. Thank you so much for doing this, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for the introduction. And it's indeed true that we met when I was a grad student. So I'm always grateful that you were very generous to dedicate time to meet and provide a lot of insights on my dissertations. So thanks again for that. And so I'm going to start. Thanks to everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure to be in this great seminar series. The paper that I'm going to be presenting today, does everyone see my screen all right? Perfect. So the paper I'm going to be presenting today is called The Exchange Rate as an Industrial Policy, and it's joint work with Diego Perez and William Witheridge. So our motivation in this paper is that there is a long-standing view in policy circles that the exchange rate is a tool that can be used to foster development. And the general idea of that is that by keeping the exchange rate depreciated, governments can improve the competitiveness of strategic sectors and speed up growth. This narrative, this discussion is usually based on some emblematic examples of prolonged growth with currency depreciation at the same time, two of which are plotted in here. So on the left panels, we have the GDP growth of China and Korea during several decades in which these economies experience growth above those of world average rates. On the right panels, we have the exchange rate expressed here as local currency per unit of foreign currency. And you see that through how this is nominal or real, these two different lines, and you see that throughout this process, these economies experience a currency depreciation. Okay, so these are usually used as examples of how, in principle, you can have the exchange rate as something that helps speed up growth. Now, what we're going to be doing in this paper is to ask the question of when and how can the exchange rate be used as an industrial policy? Okay, and for that, we're going to develop a framework, which is an open economy. So think an economy that is transitioning to a technological frontier for exogenous reasons that we're going to be taken as given in the model. And then think of an economy that has the textbook case for industrial policy, which are Marshallian production externalities that we're going to be assume are sectoral and dynamics. Okay, in particular, we're going to assume that these externalities are stronger in the trade sector and that they are also stronger in earlier stages of development, which is something that we provide evidence. Okay, and then finally, there's a key ingredient for these type of policies to affect the real exchange rate, foreign exchange rate interventions to affect the real exchange rate, which are imperfect capital mobility. Okay, in this framework, we study the optimal policy, the optimal exchange rate industrial policy for economies in different developmental stages and in different environments, and we provide a theoretical and quantitative analysis. We show a set of theoretical and quantitative results that I will start by summarizing. So first, we show that the exchange rate as an industrial policy, the optimality of these type of policies critically depend on the dynamic patterns of these externalities. For economies that are convergent towards the technological frontier, it can be welfare improving to keep the exchange rate undervalued in earlier stages of development, and that temporarily increases labor supply and direct resources to the trade sector. Okay, so those policies are implemented via foreign exchange rate interventions, and they can improve welfare relative to the decentralized competitive equilibrium. Now, we're going to show that in economies that are not convergent to a technological frontier, these type of policies might not be desirable. That is, if you have an externality that does not feature a dynamic pattern, these type of policies are not welfare improving in general. And then, we're also going to argue that the effectiveness of these type of policies and how much they speed up your growth or boost economic activity critically depend on two things. First, the degree of capital mobility in the economy, the international capital mobility that the economy has, and second, the labor market dynamics. I mean, with this, we think that the model, through the lens of a model, we can think on typical historical experiences to think about when these policies work and when they don't, such as Asian economies or the cases of Latin America. Then we are going to do a quantitative analysis applied to China's growth takeoff. We're going to show that the observed reserve accumulation speeded up growth by 1% during 15 years. These policies can have potentially sizable effects. And what the main point I want to finish by arguing is that these exchange rate industrial policies are in fact complementary to more classic industrial policies that we think at least as time invariant policies that don't necessarily take into account this dynamic. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll be brief with the literature. Let me just flag that we're building on the new generation of exchange rate models that link the exchange rate to imperfections in international capital markets. We build on a very rich literature. There are a lot of people that have thought about the exchange rate and industrial policy. We're thinking about providing this framework that's helpful think about when it works and when it doesn't. And then we connect more broadly to literature and international capital flows and to literature and industrial policy that has been very rich and very active, for example, in trade. Okay, so the plan for the rest of the talk is as follows. I'll start with a baseline theoretical framework. I'll characterize it. I'll then discuss the effectiveness of this exchange rate industrial policy and then go to the quantitative analysis. Okay, so I want to think of the following environment. So think of a dynamic small open economy framework with no uncertainty. I'm going to be thinking of a real economy because we think on the course of growth throughout decades. So the type of interventions that we want to think are at a frequency which is more natural to think on a real economy. Then we're going to be considering an economy that converges to the technological frontier and has these two sectors, trail and non-trail in the baseline model. Then we enrich it to more multiple sectors in extensions. Okay, there are these Marshallian production externalities that I'm going to describe, which are sectoral and dynamic, and segmented asset markets that allow the government to intervene and affect the exchange. Okay, so how are the households? The households are super simple. Think of a representative household that have standard time CEPR preferences or consumption and leisure. Consumption is an aggregator of trails and non-trail goods. And then they face the budget constraint that you have in the following equation, in which on the left-hand side, I have the uses of income, trail and non-trail consumption, and the purchase of bonds. On the right-hand side, I have the sources of income, the labor income transfer from firms or the government, and the proceeds from the garments that they purchased in the previous period. Now here, I want to flag our first key assumption is the one of market segmentation. These households only have access to these bonds in local currency, and this interest rate R is the bond that these bonds in local currency play in this economy. Okay, this is the key assumption of market segmentation that I'm doing, and then we relax it also in model extension. Okay, now the optimality conditions for the households are very standard. One that equates the marginal rates of substitution between trail and non-trail consumption to the relative price of non-trail goods. The R that equates the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure to the real wage. And then we have another equation that equates the marginal cost of saving today to the discounted marginal benefit of saving tomorrow using these bonds and this interest rate. Okay, very standard. Now, this is where the key of the model is. We have in each sector a representative firm that produces outputs using labor and productivity as inputs. Okay, so for a given productivity. We are here denoting by L the individual labor at the firm peaks. And then the productivity is itself the product of two components. One of these components is exogenous, which is this A, which is precisely what we are taking as given in the model, and think about, an exogenous convergence process. So think about A star as a technological frontier, for example, the United States, and think of a country that starts below the technological frontier and could be converging to a fraction of that technological frontier, phi times A. And this raw process governs the speed of convergence to a technological frontier. Okay, so we're taking as given what are the institutional environments that make this country to converge, and we're taking as given the fact that economy is indeed converging. Okay, then the key assumption that we have here are these Marshallian production externalities. As I was telling you, these are the textbook case for industrial policies in the trade literature. So what they mean is that the productivity of firms in a particular sector are going to depend on the aggregate labor that is used in the sector, which is denoted here by L. And that L is elevated to the power, certain power of gamma IT. Okay, so you see that the strength of this externality is governed by this gamma IT and is sectoral specific and is dynamic. So what do we mean by dynamic? So we're going to be assuming that this externality is increasing in the distance of the technological frontier of the country. Okay, so we're going to be linking how far away is this country from the technological frontier, and it's an aspect that has been considered in the literature. The fact that there could be various reasons linked, for example, to infant industries or other reasons by which in earlier stages of development your externalities might be larger than they are later on when you converge. And the second assumption we're going to be doing is that the classic proven argument that these externalities can be stronger in the trade sector. For simplicity, I'm going to be assuming that there are no externalities in the non-trade sector. This is something also we relax in the paper, and we discuss there in what senses it matters and in what senses. The important thing here is that you see that the labor demand that I have here on the last equation equates the private marginal product of labor to a real wage. That is, individual firms, when they choose their labor, they don't internalize the fact that there is these extra terms that come from the whole size from the sector. It has the source of this extra. And again, this dynamic component is something I'm going to be providing further evidence. And then finally, the last agent here is the government. The government does these foreign exchange interventions, or FXI. What does it mean? The government accumulates assets in foreign currency, denoted here by F star, and accumulates assets in local currency, noted here by F. It satisfies the budget constraint that we have in here expressed in local currency. So this E will be the exchange rate in terms of units of local currency per units of foreign currency. And you see that the government does this portfolio in which, for example, they can accumulate assets and finance that by borrowing from the households, and they are going to be transferring the proceeds from these portfolio operations to the household in a lump sum fashion. So you see here that when the government invests in these foreign assets, they earn an interest rate R star, which is determined by the rest of the world. That's our small open economy assumption. When the government invests in these local currency bonds F, they earn this endogenous interest rate R. How is this interest rate R determined? Well, they are determined through this international asset market segmentation, which is connected to the work of Cabex Majori and Skokie Mukin, and tells us that these bonds these local currency bonds are in zero net supply. So whatever the households purchase and or government purchases has to add up to zero. Okay, so you see here how when the government accumulates foreign assets and finance those by borrowing from the households, they're going to be affecting the interest rate that households perceive on their borrowing, and therefore are going to be affecting the allocations. Now, the government notes that here is the only agent that has access to this internationally traded bonds with the rest of the world are, and therefore, by accumulating assets, it's going to govern how much external savings this economy makes, and also affecting the balance of payments condition. A couple of normalizations. I'm going to be considering a price of tradable goods in the rest of the world, price of non-tradable goods at home, both to be normalized to one. So under those conditions, this real exchange rate P is the inverse of the exchange rate that I have been considering. The relative price between these non-tradable goods is the inverse of the the exchange. All right, that's the setup that we're going to be considering. Now, I want to describe a competitive equilibrium before we continue, and I'm going to be defining it the standard way. It's going to be a set of allocations and prices such that everyone optimizes in market clear. Let me describe how this competitive equilibrium looks like. In the competitive equilibrium, the marginal rate of substitution between trail and non-trail goods is equal to the private marginal rate of transformation between trails and non-trail goods that you have here on the right-hand side. The marginal rate of substitution between leisure and consumption is equal to the private marginal product of labor that you have into here. And then you have these market clearing conditions for the non-trail market that equates non-trail consumption to whatever is produced in the non-trail sector, and the balance of payment conditions that I was just describing you, that indicates that the net exports that an economy does, which is how much it produces of trail goods minus how much it consumes of trail goods, equal precisely the foreign assets that the government is exporting. Okay, that's how the competitive equilibrium looks like. Okay, what I want to think about now is to think of, first I'm going to talk about the first best problem, then I'm going to go to the exchange rate industrial policy. So what is the first best in this economy? As usual, first best is to maximize household welfare subject to technological constraints in the economy, which are represented here by the market clearing condition in the non-trail sector and the balance of payment condition that I just showed. So know what the planner does in this economy. What would like a first best planner do? The planner will equate the marginal rate of substitution between trails and non-trail goods to the social marginal rate of transformation. That know that here this differs because the planner does internalize that when they hire one additional unit of labor in the trail sector, that increases the size of that sector and that boosts productivity in that sector because of the Marshallian externality. The planner also equates the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure to the social marginal product of labor, which again takes into account these additional benefits that there is at the aggregate level coming from the Marshallian externalities. And note that the third condition, what it tells us is that a first best planner would like to have an Euler equation that equates the marginal cost of saving today to the discounted marginal benefit of saving using the interest rate from the rest of the world. This is something that I'm going to be calling an undistorted Euler equation. What does it mean? It means that if the government borrows on behalf of the household, then the government internalizes that the return of borrowing from the rest of the world is linked to that interest rate in the rest of the world is R star. Okay, that's what a first best planner would. Okay, now in this environment, I want to think about the following, which is the first result that I want to discuss, which is an impossibility result. In particular, we can show that in this environment, that the first best allocation that I just showed you is not attainable through foreign exchange rate intervention. Okay, and the reason is pretty intuitive. Think what the foreign exchange rate intervention does that I just described. The foreign exchange rate interventions distort consumption intertemporally. The government accumulates assets, does that by borrowing from households in the rest of the world. So it's affecting consumption intertemporally. It's not directly affecting the labor margin, which is the source of the externality. In this setup with these Marshallian externalities, we have in fact a repeated set of static externalities. So you cannot correct those by distorting the households intertemporally. What could you do? What would decentralize this first best allocation that I will just show you? Well, if the planner has access to time-varying labor subsidies, then the planner can attain that first best allocation that I just described to you. Okay, now note here, what is the formula that these optimal taxes have? They are precisely linked to the strength of the externality in the trail sector. So if the externalities are stronger in earlier stages of transition, that would imply that the government would have to make high subsidies in early stages of transitions and then take those subsidies out. There could be plenty of arguments of political economy reasons why this is something challenging to do. So we're going to be thinking in practice of a government that does not have access to these time-varying sector-specific subsidies. Okay, so if those, but I want to be upfront. If those are on the table, then this is how you can distort the externality, right? You wouldn't need the exchange and industrial policy if you have access to these temporary flavors. Insofar as there are limits to this, coming either from WTO or from political economy reasons, you might want to entertain this exchange rate industrial policy that I'm going to be describing. Okay, so any questions so far?
Yeah, usually we have question at the end, but
No, perfect,
people
perfect.
can
I can continue.
people
I
can
just want to see if
post
there are any
in the
clarifying.
chat, but I don't see any chat questions. So go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. All right. So what is the exchange rate industrial policy? So the exchange rate industrial policy is to choose your portfolio of foreign assets and domestic assets to maximize households' welfare, subject to all the set of implementability constraints that define the competitive equilibrium that I just showed you. Okay, so what are the optimality conditions that come from this problem? Well, we have the same set of constraints that characterize the competitive equilibrium that I just showed you in equating the marginal rate of substitution between trails and non-trail goods to the private marginal rate of transformation, equating the marginal rate of substitution between conceptual leisure to the private marginal product of labor, market clearing condition in non-trail goods, balance of payment conditions. So the key new condition that arises in this problem is the Euler equation that I have plotted here. So remember, in a first best word, the planner has this undistorted Euler equation in which it borrows on behalf of the household, and it takes into account that interest rates from the rest of the world are sound. The planner here has a different Euler equation that has these distortions here that are these thetas. Okay, these thetas are a complex object that depends on two things, depends on the whole allocation X, and depends on the strength of the externality. So what does it tell you? It tells you that the government that has access to this FXI, this foreign exchange rate intervention, is willing to distort the households intertemporally to try to partially correct for these Marshallian externalities, which are time varying. And that is expressed on the fact that when the government decides how much it wants to make the household save, it's going to be having a wedge relative to the undistorted Euler equation from the first one. Okay, now to characterize that wedge, it is helpful to consider an analytical case, and we're going to be relaxing these assumptions in the quantitative environment. And these are colossal preferences, and which have a very nice feature that you can separate the non-trail sector from the rest of the economy. So under these type of preferences, you see that consumption is in the non-trail goods are just a function of productivity, which is exogenous here, and parameters of the economy. So the exchange rate industrial policy planner simplifies substantially, and is the one that you have here in the slide, which is to maximize the lifetime utility from trail consumption and this utility from working in the trail sector, subject to the implementability constraint that the marginal rate of substitution has to be equal to the marginal product of labor and to the resource constraint of the economy. You see that this problem is much simpler, and we're going to be considering a quadratic linear approximation of this problem around the first best for analytical characterization. Okay, now comes the key of how does this exchange rate industrial policy work, or what would the planner would like to do? And I'm going to be representing this graphically. So I'm going to start, imagine an economy that suddenly a planner takes over and decides to start implementing this foreign exchange intervention. And then we're going to be characterizing in the following slides the path after this. But think about this in the initial period in which a planner takes over. I'm representing on the left panel the market of non-trail goods with non-trail consumption on the horizontal axis, the relative price of non-trail goods on the vertical axis, and we have a downward sloping demand and an upward sloping supply that comes from the optimality of households and furniture space. Then we have on the right panel the labor market, in which we have labor on the horizontal axis, this wage on the real wage on the vertical axis, and we have the two, the infinitely elastic households labor supply with the assumptions that I'm making, and the two downward sloping demands on the non-trail and on the trail sectors. All right. Now this is the initial equilibrium that I'm representing. What does the planner does when the planner takes over? So the planner accumulates assets in foreign currency and finance those by borrowing from the household. So the fact that the planner is borrowing from the household implies that there is a contraction of households' demand in the non-trail market, which pushes down the price, the relative price of non-trail goods. That implies that firms in the non-trail sector are going to be willing to hire less labor, which is, a decrease in the demand of work from the non-trail sector, and therefore something that we call a first channel from this policy, which is a demand reallocation. Less workers are working in the non-trail sector relative to the initial equilibrium. There's a second effect, though, that is that the fact that these households are consuming less is also inducing those households to supply more labor. And we're representing here as an expansion of the labor supply. And this implies that there's a lower wage that is perceived by these firms in the non-trade sector, and therefore there's an expansion on the supply of non-trade goods. With the type of preferences, colossal preferences that we're considering, these two effects exactly offset each other. So you see that we finish up with the same allocation in the non-trade sector, but we have more labor in the trade sector. This is exactly the direction in which a first best planner would like to do. The first best planner in this economy would like households to supply more labor and to allocate that labor in the trade sector, which is where the externalities are. So you see that this exchange industrial policy is inducing the equilibrium of the economy to move to that direction, but it's not going all the way as much as a first planner would, precisely because the exchange industrial policy implies a distortion relative to that first best that has this undistorted aggregation. Okay, this is an initial period in which a planner takes over. What happens afterwards? And these are analytical figures that come from analytical results that we have in the paper characterizing the dynamics under the exchange rate industrial policy vis-a-vis a laissez-faire competitive equilibrium in which the UIP condition holds. Okay, that's the benchmark that we're using. Think on that competitive equilibrium in which the UIP condition holds. So what are these deviations? So how does the exchange rate industrial policy equilibrium looks like relative to that decentralized equilibrium? Well, on the left, we have the path of the exogenous productivity, here the gray line, that we're assuming that the economy is converging to a technological frontier. And this implies a decaying path of externalities. So the planner tries to exploit the dynamic path of these externalities, the exchange rate industrial policy planner, and it does that, as I just mentioned, by decreasing trade consumption initially and boosting trade output initially. Note that relative to the first best would imply, because the economy is having a higher permanent income, the planner would like to consume more in principle if it could. So note that here, the way in which the exchange industrial planner changes the allocations is that it wants to induce more labor in the trade sector, but it has to substantially distort the allocation relative to that first best planner will do. That is, it increases labor in the trade sector by making households to consume less in the initial periods of the transition. It implements that through accumulation of foreign assets, and you have here two key distinguishing features of these type of experiences, which is a high trade balance, trade surpluses in early on in the transition, and a depreciated currency relative to that competitive equilibrium. All right, so that's the main characterization that I want to show you about how the policy looks. Now that we have the model, we can also discuss, I show you a condition in which it works, but I want to discuss what are three key ingredients that determine the effectiveness of this policy. Okay, so I'm going to show you three key elements that we discuss more in the paper, but those are the ones I want to highlight. Number one, the optimal policy critically depends on the dynamic patterns of this externality. And to show this, we can see what would the optimal policy be in an environment in which the economy is not converging. So far, I initialized the economy below its state of convergence. Here, I'm starting at the level of the state levels of productivity. And that implies in our framework that the externalities are the same early on in the transition as they are in all the rest of the periods in the economy. So what we can show there is that if the externality does not exhibit a dynamic pattern, then the Planner-Euler equation will feature this wedge, but this wedge is not different today than it is tomorrow. If the externality is the same, then there are no optimal distortions that come from these intertemporal conditions. And again, this is kind of pretty intuitive. The planner will not like to distort consumption if the benefits of doing that, the externality, the benefits from exploiting the externality today are the same as the benefit of exploiting that externality in the future. And this implies that if the economy is not converging, the optimal exchange industrial policy is the laissez-faire competitive equilibrium. It coincides So there is no room for an optimal exchange rate industrial. Okay, this is from a welfare perspective. That's the first element that matters. If you, the takeaway from a policy perspective would be, if you want to implement these exchange rate industrial policies, make sure, if you want to improve welfare, that the economy is converging towards technological frontier. What is the second element that matters? Well, the second element is the degree of capital mobility in the economy. And for that, we can extend the model that I just showed you by introducing financial intermediaries that can access these local markets. And we're going to be considering frictional financial intermediaries, like ABEX and Majori, that have a very nice expression. That is, if you allow these foreign intermediaries to access these bond markets, and these intermediaries face the type of financial frictions that ABEX and Majori consider, then the amount that they will be willing to invest in the economy, and we're noting here by Q, is going to be a function of the difference in returns of the carry trade, the difference between the return of investing in the local currency and investing in the foreign currency, and is going to be governed by this parameter gamma that nests two polar cases. First, the baseline model is with gamma infinity, in which these intermediaries do not participate in the market. And if you make gamma tend to 0, you're approaching the world with fully integrated capital markets. Note here that if capital markets are fully perfect, they're fully mobile, financial intermediaries do not play any friction, they can access the bond market, then the foreign exchange rate intervention will be completely ineffective. That is a sense in which international capital markets imperfections are an essential ingredient for this FXI to have an effect in the real exchange rate in this environment. Okay, now what we can also say is that the optimal exchange rate industrial policy, when you have these frictional financial intermediaries like ABEX Majori, are less active than in an economy that has fully segmented asset markets. Or in other words, the effectiveness of the exchange rate industrial policy is a function of the degree of international capital markets imperfections. The more you're close to a perfect capital market economy, the less this type of policies work. What are the implications for policies? Well, it's twofold. So first, you can introduce international capital markets imperfections, such as taxes on carry trade of profits. And if you do that, you enhance the effectiveness of this exchange rate industrial policy. Second, you can also use capital controls as an industrial policy. So this is another way of saying everything that I have been saying so far as exchange rate as an industrial policy can be recasted as capital controls as an industrial policy. That is, you can achieve the same allocation with a time-varying tax on debt, even if households have access to foreign exchange, to international markets. You can implement these allocations with that type of policy. And both of these taken together is consistent with work, for example, from the paper internationalizing like China, that has shown that countries like China have opened the capital account slowly and have imposed a lot of restrictions initially in early stages of the transition to the capital accounts. Through the length of our model, this is something that will be complementary to the type of policies that we're considering. Finally, the third element that I want to highlight is the labor supply, the role of the labor supply. We can also show that the exchange industrial policy is more desirable the more elastic the labor supply is. And this is also pretty intuitive, right? So for each unit that you store household allocation, the more elastic the tradable supply is, the more you have a bang for the buck of how much you are exploiting that externality. We also entertain a version with multiple tradable sectors. Something that is interesting here, like imagine that you have various sectors that differ on the strength of this externality. Well, the exchange rate industrial policy in this case does a weighted average of the different externalities or distortions that the different sectors have. But the weights that it puts on these are a function of how elastic the labor supply in that sector is. For example, if you have a sector that has a lot of externalities, but in which the labor supply is very inelastic, then the planner will not put so much weight in the externalities of that sector. Okay, those are the main three things that I want to characterize of when, under what conditions, the exchange rate industrial policy is optimal and under what conditions it works. Now, with this, we can reassess historical experiences. That is, we can use our model to think about, to reassess the policy discussion that I started with. So in particular, I think that Asian growth miracles are typically presented as emblematic examples of export-led growth with foreign exchange rate interventions. Now, through the lens of our model, these experiences feature the key ingredients for these policies to be optimal and to be effective. In particular, they were clearly in a process of convergence. They had initially underdeveloped financial markets, and they also had a lot of demographic dividends that through the lens of our model are a more elastic labor supply. Now, if you think about in Latin America, these policies are often cited as successful examples of industrial policies of this type that we're considering. Now, through the lens of our model, I think that these are economies that were not converging, or it's harder to argue that they were converging to the technological frontier. They were many times commodity producers. It's not clear that this type of commodity producers would have the type of externalities that we're considering. They had relatively more open capital accounts, and they had larger cost of variable reallocation relative to East Asian experiences. Okay, so you can see how we can use the model to rationalize the discussion or these historical experiences. Now, what I want to do in the last part of the paper, and I'm going to be able to give a summary, but of course there are more details in the paper if you're interested, is to take out the model and do a quantitative analysis and ask ourselves, okay, how relevant these external industrial policies are, how much they increase, they speed up output, how much they increase welfare, how do they compare with other policies? For this, what we do is to parameterize the model. So most of the parameters that I show you are relatively standard in the open economy macro literature. The most novel dimension that we have here is the dynamic externality that I'm going to be showing you in a second how we estimate. And then the idea is to study the exchange rate industrial policy and the observed effect intervention. Okay, so how do we estimate this dynamic externality? So we build on the methodology recently proposed by Barthelemy, Cosino, Donaldson, and Rodriguez-Clare, which is to use sector country variation to estimate these sector-specific production spillovers. Okay, so they use data for 61 countries and 15 manufacturing sectors. These are very rich and deep paper that it's not possible to summarize it on one slide. But let me tell you kind of the idea of what they do. If you want to estimate spillovers or production functions of the type that we have been considering, what you can do is to project the average low expenditure on goods from a country, a sector in a period, adjusted by the trade elasticity, on the employment of that sector, and then country, sector, and time fixed effects. Okay, now, the key idea of this paper is that if there are externalities that are of the Marshallian type that we analyze, then those should be reflected in prices. So the idea is that if a sector is larger for reasons that are exogenous to the technology, then those sectors should sell at lower prices, and therefore you should see a higher expenditure than other countries do from the goods coming from that sector. Now, given that the argument that I just made is for variations in size that are orthogonal to technology, what they do is to exploit variation in countries' factor supply and preferences to that in particular population expenditure shares as an instrument of a country sector size, right? So think of if a country's its population is big, that will make it larger. If the country tends to consume more of a particular good, that will also make it larger in that particular sector. So we first reproduce what they do, and then what we say is, okay, what we're interested in is a variant on that, which is to analyze how these externality differs with the distance to the technological frontier that I just described to you. So to their identification strategy, we add this additional term measuring the distance to the frontier of a particular country I, and therefore we analyze how much this strength of these externalities vary as a country move in the technological frontier. When we estimate this, we find, on the bottom panel, we reproduce first the results, but on the top panel, what we show is that in all the sectors that we consider, there are positive terms associated with this distance to the technological frontier. So indeed, when a country is more distant to the technological frontier, these externalities tend to be stronger than when they are close to the technological frontier. What do they imply quantitatively? Well, it's helpful to think about this if you think of the path of China, for example. So on the left, I have here the log GDP per capita relative to the United States. that China had. So China went through a massive period of convergence since the 80s to 2019 when we were finishing this. And if we feed in this distance to the technological frontier that China, that changed in China throughout decades, and we ask what are the implications of these for the externalities, well, the externality goes from more than 0.7 in earlier stages of the transition to below 0.2, which are closer to those of the United States now. So you see that our empirical estimates imply pretty large and pretty steep changes in this dynamic path of externalities for countries that are exhibiting that fast change in how much they are converging relative to the technology average. Okay, the rest of the parameters are pretty standard, so I'm going to just skip them in the interest of time, and they have more details in the paper if people are interested. Okay, now we validate the model. We show that our model is consistent with the, I mean, by definition, we calibrate this model to fit the observed path of reserves. That's kind of how we calibrate our baseline model, so we don't need to take a stance on why China is accumulating reserves. And then, we show that our model is aligned with the path of output, consumption, exports, and exchange rate depreciation that we see in these periods. Okay, now I want to show you two quantitative results. The first result that I want to show you is the effect that the observed reserve accumulations had on output in China. So on the left, I have here the observed path of reserves as a percent of GDP. So you see here that these reserves were pretty stable, and in the 2000s they started to speed up. So if we feed in this path into a model, this would imply that from 2000 to 2008, the aggregate output will be 1.6% higher than it would have been otherwise. Okay, so there's a 1.6 percentage point increase in the growth rate in this period that can be attributed to this type of policies. Over the whole period, 1980 to 2008, is 40 basis points higher growth rates associated with this type. Okay, that's result number one that tells you observed policies did indeed have a meaningful effect on growth rates, particularly in the period in which they were implemented. The second thing I want to show you is, okay, how much do we capture from the first best gains if we do this type of policies? Okay, and here in this table, I'm reporting various statistics, output in the trail and non-trail sector, consumption. You see that the first best will feature a gain in consumption equivalent terms of 0.4%. You see that the exchange rate industrial policy captures roughly a fifth of that, okay? And the reason why it does not capture those full gains is precisely because it's making consumption to be lower in the earlier stages of the transition relative to what it would have been, okay? Now, the last point I want to emphasize is that these type of policies are indeed complementary to other type of policies, right? And we're showing this as follows. So we're reporting on the left column the welfare of various type of policies and output on the right column. And here in the different lines, I have different type of policy experiments. The first best will be the first line, is the first that I show you. You see that if you do a constant trail output subsidy, you get 0.27 of that 0.41. Then if for some restriction, for example, from WTO restrictions, you cannot do this sector-specific type of subsidy, you can do a whole labor subsidy, and then you get 0.09 out of that 0.41. The exchange industrial policy has a welfare gain that I just showed you, but you see that if you combine this trail labor subsidy with the exchange industrial policy, you enhance this time invariant policy and you get even closer to the first best. So bottom line, exchange industrial policies can be used as a complement to these more classic time invariant policies and exploit the dynamic patterns of these externalities. Okay, so let me conclude and open to questions. We developed a theoretical framework to study the exchange rate and industrial policy. We said that the exchange industrial policy is desirable if externalities are stronger in early stages of the transition. We said that the effectiveness depends on capital mobility and labor market dynamism. The observed reserve accumulation in China helped speeding up their growth, especially when the reserve accumulations start being particularly large. And there are strong macro effects from these policies, especially when combined with classic time invariant industry. Thank you very much, everyone.
Wonderful, super interesting paper and great presentation. So
Thank you.
I would open it up for questions by the participants. So the way you can enter is either by writing something in the chat, but preferably you can just raise your hand and then you will be allowed to enter and just ask the question. So just raise your hand so you can come in and ask Pablo all the challenging questions. Okay, so while we are waiting for people to warm up, maybe let me just open up. I mean, we're all I guess still under the impression of yesterday's shock. I guess we have now a US administration that will think much more about exchange rate manipulation than the previous one, right? So your paper has become like probably twice as topical as a week ago. And I know this is pushing a little bit beyond what you're presenting, but still it's, I can't resist. So you've been focusing a lot on the emerging markets. I've worked on sovereign debt and populism. There, it seems like the lessons from emerging markets are increasingly applicable to the advanced countries. This paper seems to go a similar path. So what can we learn from emerging markets for kind of advanced economies, since we are a downward converging political economy-wise to the emerging market experience? So, okay, long story short, Trump they said they want to devalue the dollar, right? At the same time, they want to impose massive tariffs, cut taxes, so that will give upward pressure to both inflation and interest rates, and therefore, probably would be in line with a strong dollar, and that's what the markets, indicated in the last 2-3 days. I think there was like massive dollar appreciation. So how does your paper speak to this idea of Trump devaluing the dollar instead of doing subsidies, or how can we think of this maybe also in the age of AI technology there, right? So I think, yeah, let me push you a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christoph. So these are great questions. So let me start by saying that the framework we use can be applied to any economy. What comes from here is that if you are at the technological frontier, there are arguably not such strong dynamic path of these externalities. So from a pure welfare perspective, it will not necessarily be optimal. Well, in actual normality, it will not be optimal to do that. I mean, if the externality is the same today as it is tomorrow, which will happen if you are in the frontier, right? So then it can be another question, okay, is the interaction of technologies introduce themselves a different path? But through a model I should show you, what this tells you is like, hey, if you think of the US as a technological frontier, then it is not clear that the United States has a different strength of these Marshallian externalities today that it will have tomorrow, right? So in that case, from a pure welfare perspective, it's not clear that it will not include welfare. Now, what I do want to point out is that it does speed up growth, right? So if you think about political economic frictions, in which one thing is welfare, the other thing is output, and another thing yet is output or labor in particular sectors. So insofar as you're interested in speeding up growth in a particular sector, these policies will still do that, in the sense that they will end up directing resources to a trail sector. And if that's what you want to do, you might do it. The paper cautions that it will not improve welfare. Now, another interesting dimension of what you said is a complementary paper we're working on to think about currency wars, right? Because you can think about, so far we have been thinking of a single economy, but there are interesting interactions that come from these environments that connect to the very racing literature on geoeconomics and the different dynamics that these different countries can have. So if you have an economy such as China that has more benefits of implementing this type of policies, then it's more likely that China will apply these policies, but then it's not clear what the response of the United States will be in that case, right? So you can think about it will not make sense in the small open economy world. It will not make sense to start doing these policies if you are at the frontier and you are not affecting the world. But once you start introducing these interactions in the world, then you start having a game between the different players. And then, we're hopefully I'm going to be able to show you that paper next year. But there are interesting interactions that appear from these, and in particular, it's very key there. Does China somehow affect that technological frontier in which the United States is on, right? So depending on that is what the optimal reaction to the United States from the United States might be. But yeah, I mean, all of that is super interesting. And I want to also mention that we have been thinking on the context of this paper about tariffs. These are, if you want, different. There are different type of instruments. There are certain things you can do with tariffs in that model. So we are actually about to add that to the paper, to a current paper. But yeah, it is super interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, we organize this geoeconomic conference, and at the moment, what you see is that you have basically a lot of papers looking at individual aspects, right? So there's guys work on export controls, some work on sanctions. I think your paper is super valuable because it kind of opened the view on what traditionally we wouldn't have thought as industrial policy. So I really like that. There's now others, that focus more on tariffs, which was traditionally more like trade policy. Now it's suddenly seen as a geoeconomic tool. So I see some parallels there. So I guess what you're saying, I think, triggered me in the sense like we need more to think more about the interaction of all of this. And I think your paper already does a bit of it, which is super cool. But I think, this is where we probably should be heading, which is, I mean, it's tricky, right? It's not at all easy to do. But yeah, this is very nice. And the
thank you.
Currency war idea and also seems like seems like maybe Diego can present it here.
Awesome, thank you.
Sounds awesome. Okay, so what about the audience? I guess maybe it's the winter daylight time. People are already in darkness in Europe and not raising their hand. Yeah, I don't want to. Anybody wanting to come in, just raise your hand. Come in. I'm sure many of you will have questions that other might also have. That's usually the case. I see some names I know, but okay. I don't want to also push it too far. So I guess before I continue chatting with you, we can probably do that over coffee in DC at some point, rather than webinar. Okay, so I would say thank you so much, Pablo.
Thank you so much, Christoph.
Very cool agenda, and looking forward to more work coming out of here. And thank you for your time, and see you.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thanks everyone for having connected.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.